The Macmillan Transforming Cancer Care Lived Experience Peer Evaluator project. This presentation provides an overview of the insights gained from the National Peer Evaluator project. Our report is available separately and can be accessed for further detail. In terms of context, this project had a specific focus on seldom heard communities, and the Alliance in partnership with Macmillan Cancer Support carried out engagement from December 2022 until April of 2023. Today I'm going to give a brief overview of the methodology of the project, the demographics of our engagement sample, the key insights gained across the engagement sample before moving on to community-specific insights, and I'll finish with an overview of the suggestions made by participants to improve the cancer experience. So starting with our methodology. Engagement was carried out with 42 individuals affected by cancer, and a key role of our peer evaluators was co-designing the questions for engagement based off of their own cancer experiences and their own community identities. Peer evaluators also assisted in the co-facilitation of focus groups and interviews, and engagement questions covered the same broad topics while being tailored to the communities at hand. So engagement questions covered the same broad topics such as experiences of accessing services or supporting someone to access services, barriers to accessing services, how well services met needs, and what participants would like to change to improve experiences. All analysis was carried out in partnership with peer evaluators and was done using NVivo, which is a qualitative analysis software. So all the charts that you see today have been generated by NVivo rather than being created manually to reduce the risk of error and bias in reporting. Our main limitation relates to sample size, and as we've included in our full report, the experiences that you hear today should not be taken as generalisable and instead should reflect individual experiences only. So moving on to demographics. As our project had that specific focus on seldom heard communities, we gathered community identity from those individuals that were happy and comfortable disclosing this information. So as you can see from the slide, we had 15 individuals who didn't disclose what community that they identified with. We had 10 participants disclosed that they didn't identify with any of the communities listed on either the survey form or the focus group / interview registration form. We had 8 participants that identified with a minority ethnic community, 4 participants that identified with the sensory loss community and in particular impacted by visual impairment, 4 participants that identified with the general population, and we had 1 participant who identified with the LGBTQIA+ community. So we also wanted to be able to gather experiences from not only people who had received a diagnosis of cancer, but individuals who cared for and supported someone with a cancer diagnosis. Now, interestingly, despite opportunities being open to everyone affected by cancer, there were more individuals who were affected by cancer through caring and supporting that took part, 24 individuals, compared to individuals who were affected by cancer through a direct diagnosis, which was 18 participants. So while this project had a specific focus on seldom heard communities, we felt it important not to take a reductionist approach when reporting. So the first part of our report focuses on combined experiences across the engagement sample, and this relates to overall experiences, evaluation of services, and barriers to accessing services. And then the second half of our report relates to community-specific insights. So today I'm going to spend a short amount of time going over the collated experiences before moving on to the community-specific insights. You'll see on every slide that I've included a selection of supporting quotes. I won't spend time reading these out during the presentation, but while I am talking, they are there for you to have a read yourself. So starting with overall experiences. Positive experiences reported tended to reference personable and empathetic staff, being provided with high levels of support and readily available information. When it came to negative experiences, these tended to reference negative staff interactions, an absence or a lack of support, and in particular a lack of emotional and psychological support, gaps in information provision, and interestingly, the existence of stigma. The existence of stigma found during engagement was significant for two reasons. The first was that we expected to find some stigma, but not to the extent that we uncovered during engagement. And we also anticipated that stigma would be confined to certain communities, whereas it was evident across our entire engagement sample. So during engagement, stigma was operationalised in three main ways by participants, and these included deterring conversations, the belief that some cancers are less serious than others, and the challenges related to carer identities. So first of all, participants fed back that discussing cancer with friends or family was off-putting because of the continued negative connotations associated with cancer, and participants used words like monster and death when describing cancer during engagement. Some participants felt that they couldn't access cancer support services, or that they didn't have a right to access cancer support services because of this perception that some cancers are less serious than others, and this is captured really well in this second quote here on the slide. And finally, among individuals caring for and supporting someone with a cancer diagnosis, participants reported feeling undeserving of care because they hadn't been the one to receive a diagnosis of cancer. And among these participants, there was a reported lack of confidence in the appropriateness of accessing cancer support services as carers. We then looked at how participants evaluated cancer services. And feedback on experiences of accessing clinical cancer services were mixed and can be broken down into positive and negative evaluations, although more heavily weighted in the positive direction. Positive evaluations cited factors such as kind, helpful and knowledgeable staff, and importantly, the positive outcomes of any treatment received or witnessed. On the other hand, negative evaluations cited factors such as experiencing gaps in knowledge in primary care settings, so either not receiving any information from a GP about a cancer diagnosis, or receiving information that was unclear or confusing. A lack of signposting to emotional and psychological support, and finally, a lack of satisfaction at the level of care that was provided. So moving on to cancer support organisations. As you can see from the slide, not everyone that participated in our engagement accessed cancer support services. 18 participants reported that they had accessed cancer support services, 19 participants reported that they had not, and 5 participants declined to provide an answer to this question. And as we can see from the slide, cancer support services were accessed more by individuals affected by cancer through diagnosis compared to individuals affected by cancer through caring for and supporting someone with a diagnosis. Before we move on to covering evaluations of cancer support services, we wanted to know, out of those that did access services, was there any pattern in the community identity of those individuals? This chart breaks down what communities accessed cancer support services out of our sample. And as you can see from the slide, 7 participants who accessed cancer support services did not disclose what community that they identified with. 5 participants that accessed cancer support services didn't identify with any of the listed communities. 3 participants that accessed cancer support services identified with a minority ethnic community. 2 participants that accessed cancer support services identified with the general population, and 1 participant that accessed cancer support services identified with the sensory loss community and impacted by visual impairment in particular. So in terms of evaluations, there were more positive evaluations than negative. And as we can see from the slide, positive evaluations referenced supportive staff, high levels of support and comfortable environments. while negative evaluations cited a lack of follow-up communications and negative reactions from staff in response to the cancellation of support sessions by individuals affected by cancer. One of the key aims of this work was to investigate what barriers people face when accessing or attempting to access services. A total of 29 out of 42 participants reported experiencing at least one barrier when accessing or attempting to access services. The chart in this slide shows that the 5 most commonly referenced barriers to accessing cancer services across the engagement sample consisted of primary care difficulties and receiving a diagnosis, confidence, distance, transport, and not knowing that cancer support services existed. So if we break this down further, during analysis it was also important to decipher not just what barriers were the most frequently mentioned, but how many individuals referenced a given barrier. So while primary care and difficulties with receiving a diagnosis was the most frequently referenced barrier and dominated certain discussions, it was only referenced by 10 participants. Conversely, although the barrier of not knowing that services existed was only mentioned 14 times, it was mentioned by the greatest number of participants along with transport. So bringing this section to a close, this slide contains example quotes provided by participants on the topic of barriers. Starting with confidence and primary care, participants fed back that they felt they had to fight and push to receive a diagnosis, and that primary care almost acted as an initial barrier in their journey that they had to overcome. However, following diagnosis, interactions with specialty services appeared to be much more pleasant. The issues of transport and distance to appointments were also commonly referenced barriers. And finally, participants cited the main reason for not accessing services was due to not knowing that cancer support services existed, what they offered, and where to find them. The remainder of this presentation will focus on the insights gained from individuals affected by cancer with sensory loss and specifically impacted by visual impairment, and also minority ethnic communities. Beginning with the sensory loss community, we had 4 individuals affected by cancer who were impacted by visual impairment participate in this engagement. The chart on this slide demonstrates reported experience in comparison to the general population. And as you can see, participants from the sensory loss community who've been impacted by visual impairment rated support overall more negatively, mentioned the gap in emotional support more often, and had more negative staff interactions than the general population. In terms of overall experiences, there was a greater number of negative experiences than positive experiences reported by this cohort. In terms of positive experience, reference was made to the importance of involving third sector organisations such as Deafblind Scotland, the importance of care being delivered by staff who are experienced in working with visual impairment, and crucially, the accessibility of information. Those that reported negative experiences cited the negative interactions that they had with staff, a noticeable lack of understanding displayed by staff of how visual impairment interacts with the cancer experience, being provided with information that was not accessible, and experiencing clinical processes that were not accessible. The next slide contains an example of a first-hand encounter that really captures that lack of understanding that individuals face around visual impairment and cancer. So this participant shared that the perception that being blind, I wouldn't know what I looked like, and a comment was made by the surgeon that it would be much easier for me because I wouldn't know what I looked like post-surgery. So it wouldn't make any difference, and so I wouldn't need counselling, and that it was a benefit of being blind because I wouldn't see anyone's looks to me. He was giving that to me as a positive. Because you're blind, it will be an advantage because you won't see anyone looking at you. So this participant really summed up the lack of understanding that they personally encountered during their own cancer experience. Moving on to the barriers, this chart illustrates several additional barriers that are unique to this community. And these barriers include feeling dismissed and invisible, feeling that the system isn't designed for individuals with visual impairment, and accessibility, both in terms of information and in terms of movement. Participants reported that they often felt invisible during clinical appointments and felt talked about rather than talked to. Participants also reported that they felt the healthcare system and cancer services are not designed for individuals with sensory loss, and that this hinders their ability to use services effectively. And for example, participants commented that the system is only really equipped for an able-bodied person. In terms of accessibility of movement, participants raised a range of challenges surrounding physically accessing appointments. This included the length of appointment times, difficulties arranging support, and the practices of specific hospitals and healthcare environments. And finally, a common barrier was receiving information that was not accessible or in the wrong format. And for example, you'll see from the last quote on the slide that this specific level of Braille is an important consideration for individuals with visual impairment, yet it's not something that's routinely gathered in clinical settings. Moving on to minority ethnic communities, we had 8 individuals who identified with a minority ethnic community affected by cancer take part in this engagement. Individuals who identified with a minority ethnic community reported more instances of available information provision, rated cancer support services more positively, but also reported more instances of negative staff interactions and rated clinical care more negatively when compared to the general population. For this community, positive experiences referenced the kindness and empathy of staff and support in arranging translation provision. However, negative experiences tended to reference a lack of available information, and on this factor, several participants emphasised the challenges of experiencing not just a lack of information, but a lack of clarity relating to treatment options, which can be summarised from this third quote on the slide. Negative experiences also referenced a lack of signposting and support, and negative interactions with staff. Community-specific barriers for individuals affected by cancer from minority ethnic communities include understanding the system of the NHS as a whole, language barriers, and the impact that culture can have on the cancer experience. Participants explained that a particular barrier when receiving a cancer diagnosis and attempting to access cancer services was how well they understood the healthcare system, and specifically the NHS, and commented that clarification was needed about the system early and all the way through. Similarly to the concept of feeling invisible among the sensory loss community, the feeling of no one is listening was discussed during engagement, and participants reflected that one of the most difficult aspects of the cancer experience was the feeling that no one was taking their concerns seriously. Language barriers were also a common barrier reported. And finally, just drawing your attention to the last quote on this slide. An aim of this engagement was to understand the impact of culture on cancer experiences, and this aim was informed by our minority ethnic peer evaluator, who identified this gap in knowledge. Now, we've stressed in our final report that the impact that culture can have on the cancer experience represents a separate research question in its own right. But of the responses that we did receive, participants felt that context is important, and cultural context in particular can impact on the access behaviours of individuals. And this can be seen from the last quote on this slide. So drawing this presentation to a close, we provided participants with an opportunity to voice what they felt could be done to improve cancer experiences, both as individuals who have received a diagnosis and individuals who have cared for and supported an individual with cancer. individuals with sensory loss impacted by visual impairment who've been affected by cancer, suggestions to improve experiences centred around an increase in accessible information, increased training on how visual impairment impacts the cancer experience. So, for example, one participant suggested the use of patient experts, person-centred care, policy changes, and these are hospital specific. So, for example, one participant spoke of recent changes to her local hospital and commented that if she was now to be admitted for emergency treatment, the porters would know what to do with her guide dog. Organisational changes, and these are cancer support specific, and these are related to greater accessibility in cancer support services, more informational videos, and increased signposting. For individuals from minority ethnic communities, suggestions to improve experiences centred around increases in care, increases in information, more signposting, changes to hospital policy. So, for example, if someone registers as non-English speaking, having the ability to send letters out in their preferred language, and training for communities regarding healthy lifestyles. And finally, in terms of collated suggestions across the engagement sample, suggestions included more person-centred care, more accessible information, increased information, more training for staff, increases in local support, appointment varieties, and increased signposting. We've now reached the end of our presentation, and this was a very quick glimpse into our findings. If you would like to find out more, please consult our full report, which is available separately.